it's become an overloaded term. Interoperability is anytime someone's like, ooh, I'm connecting two softwares, they're saying, oh, interoperability. That's wrong. I think that's wrong in my book, at least. It makes it too big, too muddy to have any real meaning or value. I personally separate it out into sort of like two main types of things. There's interoperability, which is connecting between different enterprises. And then there's integration or intraoperability. So within an enterprise, how do I connect my systems?
Welcome to Concept to Care, where we hear candid stories of success and failure, discuss strategy, and dive into the details that offer advice on what to do and what not to do in health tech.
Whether you're a seasoned pro, growing your career, or just starting out, our aim for this podcast is to be relevant, real world, and tactical. We're dedicated to not only entertaining you all, but also empowering you with actionable insights that can be applied beyond the podcast, one concept at a time.
This is Angela.
And this is Omar.
Welcome to Concept to Care.
In today's episode, we're talking to Brendan Keeler. He's the head of product at Flexpa. Flexpa is a developer-friendly infrastructure that connects applications to identified claims data. Flexpa enables effortless sharing of claims data with your application in seconds. They've created the fastest, simplest, HIPAA-compliant method for accessing identified claims data for anyone. In this episode, you're going to hear about Brendan's experience at Epic and the role it played in laying the foundation for his healthcare career. Brendan will give us a masterclass in interoperability, the types of problems, and an in-depth view of the solutions in the market today. He will walk through his EMR selection playbook and share an intimate love letter to a particular EMR vendor. We will dissect Brendan's brain for how he thinks about tech startup culture and how that manifests within Flexpa. Lastly, we understand the origin story of the health API guy and share lots of laughs throughout the episode. Enjoy the conversation. We sure did. Brendan Keeler, the health API guy. Welcome to Concept to Care.
So glad to be here.
We were really excited. Angela and I have been raving about this upcoming recording, so we're really excited to get into a lot of the interoperability topics and some of the other things you've been talking about lately. Before we get into all of that, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Man in many homes. So Jersey, Philly, went to Indiana for college, went to Notre Dame.
Go Hoosiers.
Jumped up to, there you go. Jumped up to Wisconsin, worked while working at Epic, and then the Netherlands for a couple of years, San Francisco, and now Portland. So been all over. I have a twin brother, so I technically have the transitive property and can claim even more homes because you may see me in Chicago or Denver. And yeah, I've been in healthcare interoperability via Epic, via Redox, via Zeus, and now Flexpa my whole career.
You said that you started your journey and, you've been at Epic. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
You ever seen like Star Wars, like the Death Star? It's like being inside of that. No, I'm just kidding. It's like a great place to learn healthcare. You're in a dominant EHR. You're surrounded by young people. They hire out of college. So you have all these fun, young, talented people. It's not a total, like all fun. You can't drink with customers. There's all these like unique cultural elements to Epic. And it was a very intense workplace. It was like 90, 100-hour weeks. You'd be really grinding. But to go from just like, oh, I have a comp sci degree to, oh, I have a on-the-job master's in healthcare, Epic was really good for that.
And when we were talking with you earlier, you had said that, you have some fun stories that you might be able to share with us about your time there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let's see. Which one do you want to hear? Do you want to hear about the time the guy got in front of the 13,000 people and talked about his dog pooping? Like that was really fun. I think like it's just like an interesting, it breaks all the molds of like what successful companies look like, right? It's entirely private. It's never going to be acquired. It will never acquire companies. Everything's built by Epic. So like there's no Salesforce. It's this own CRM that's like the chassis of it is the same thing as the EHR. There's no Zendesk. Like there's this SLG, support log thing. Sorry, acronym. It's Epic specific. No one would know what it means. These support logs are also built in the same chassis. So like everything outside of like core Microsoft Word and that sort of thing is built internally. And so that's like it's not how you're taught outside of that company, like what a company trajectory looks like. You're not taught that you don't need to take venture capital money. You don't need to look to be acquired, that you don't need to go public. And so I don't know if those things are right or wrong, but it's hard to argue that Epic's been really successful. And yeah, it was really good. They offered things like a sabbatical. So I got to go on my wife's sabbatical. She was an Epic employee as well at 5 years. And then I got to go on my sabbatical. And then I got back and I handed my laptop in and said, I'm done, and moved back to the States.
That sounds incredible. Brendan, your career's been primarily in healthcare, or for the most part, all of healthcare. And then in interoperability, you've become sort of a subject matter expert in interoperability. For our audience, can you just define in your own words what interoperability is and what is the distinction between interoperating and then integration itself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's become an overloaded term, right? Interoperability is anytime someone's like, "Ooh, I'm connecting two softwares," they're saying, "Oh, interoperability." That's wrong. I think that's wrong in my book, at least. It makes it too big, too muddy to have any real meaning or value. I personally separate it out into sort of like two main types of things. There's interoperability, which is connecting between different enterprises. And then there's integration or intraoperability. So within an enterprise, how do I connect my systems? And so integration, that intraoperability, it's really old, right? Like as soon as like UCSF or whoever the first hospital was that started doing software, like proto EHR, they started to be like, ooh, like how do I connect that to my lab system and my registration system? And so all that integration, like it has cruft, it has this buildup of technologies to connect since the 1970s, the 1980s. And you get all these weird acronyms. I'm going to say a bunch of them. We're not going to explain them, but they're common in healthcare. There's HL7, there's X12, there's FHIR, there's CSVs, there's proprietary APIs. And all that buildup is meant to accomplish the same goal, which is how am I integrating these ancillary applications with my core EHR? And so that integration problem, that's one problem. Separate from that is interoperability. It's how does Ventricle Health talk to Accolade? How does Accolade talk to an employer or a payer? You know, like it's how do all the players that exist, these disparate organizations, interact? And so that's providers to payers, that's providers to pharmacies, that's providers to other providers, and so much more. It's not just simple like, oh, let me pass back clinical data back and forth over HIEs, you know, the Zeuses and the particles and the health gorillas. It's really also pretty old as the claims clearinghouse. So like all that interoperability, that problem space is just about how do we make an ecosystem where there's digital transactions between the players and healthcare, these different enterprises.
So if you're submitting claims to the clearinghouse, are you interoperating?
Yeah, 100%, right? You're sending to a payer. They're another covered entity. And thinking about it in that way, you can start to say, okay, whoa, interoperability is a number of sub-problems. Which one am I tackling and what are the right tools to solve that problem?
I always thought that was like step one, but interoperability felt like this other harder problem. So it's interesting that like organizations have been interoperating.
It's a great point. Like some of these are very solved problems. Claims, except when Change Healthcare is down, is a solved problem. But if you keep going down up the maturity curve as a virtual clinic, as a digital health provider organization, a tech-enabled provider organization, you're going to start to hit ones that are kind of solved, right? Like the HIEs. You're going to start pulling data and be like, this isn't all the data. This is 70% of data. You keep going, you're like, let me do referrals or let me do prior authorization. Let me do scheduling. Can't do it. It's not solved yet. So there's interoperability problems that are completely unsolved, all the way to completely solved. And I think as a PM in healthcare, you venture in and you start to be like, ooh, is this one of the solved ones or one of the semi-solved ones or not solved at all?
That is very interesting. So we think about interoperability as the holy grail. And I'm hearing you say, listen, interoperability has been around for a long time. There are certain areas that have been solved. Maybe you could tell us what areas you feel like have been solved very well versus what areas we have a long way to go. And for those, why is it so hard? Why haven't we figured it out yet?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's exactly that interoperability. You crack it open, and it's not a single problem to be solved. These component parts, some are simple because we've had to do them from day one, or like billing needs to occur. And so the claims data networks, eligibility, those are some of the first things that a provider organization needs to tackle. Generally, right? Like there's different go-to-markets, but generally that's like one of the first ones. You go and you figure out which clearinghouse you're going to use or which API vendor to overlay a clearinghouse, and you move on to the next thing. That's probably e-prescribing because sending meds is pretty important. That's solved, right? SureScripts exists. There's on-ramps to SureScripts. Checkmark, on to the next one. Lab integration. Okay, checkmark. Clinical data exchange. And so you start to see, you move down that progression, and so you skip some if your business doesn't, like if your go-to-market or different business needs don't align with it. But you see that common pattern of moving through this maturity curve and solving different interoperability problems, and then eventually being like, okay, this one for scheduling, that's a phone call. The way we're going to interoperate is via fax or phone call, because that's the fallback for all this is analog workflows.
So how have these problems manifested? Angela talks about the alphabet soup that we have today. So for example, like what are the data standards and what are the solutions that have made it possible for these organizations to communicate with one another?
So like alphabet soup is common in tech. It's not just healthcare, but it's like in tech, you accumulate cruft based on when tech is adopted. And so if you look at like programming languages, we change programming languages every few years in terms of what's dominant, like what's the cool stuff to use behind the scenes. And you sort of have that with healthcare standards. And so you have HL7V2, and that's in the 1980s, 1990s. You have HL7V3 and the continuity of care document, CDA. That's in the 2000s and 2010s. You have FHIR, which is the popular hot standard now. And these are all like trendy and vogue. They might solve different problems. There's other ancillary standards like X12 and NCPDP. And so if you sort of like look at which standards are used to solve different problems, you're almost like a geologist dating something via the lithosphere, or an arbologist looking at tree rings. We build up these layers of standards. And if you say, okay, claims is via X12, X12 was really popular early on. So this was a problem that was solved in the 90s. If you say, oh, this one was solved via NCPDP or CDA, it's like, oh, that was the 2000s or 2010s. So yeah, you can do this sort of archaeology on it all and see that we've built up this history and this complexity over time. And so since not everyone is the metaphoric arbologist, archaeologist, or whatever, they don't have the time or cognitive capacity to think about that and also solve the problem they want to solve. You have all these API companies that exist to insulate, to keep you not having to deal with old standards and old technologies. And so there's a huge growth in those in healthcare in the past 5 years.
What are the different types of organizations that are looking to interoperate better? And what workflows are they trying to support? What do you see the most often?
Yeah, sure. I mean, think of everyone that's involved in healthcare. I'm going to go categorically through it and try and list the major organizational types, but there's probably more. You got traditional hospitals and clinics. You have virtual care clinics. You have tech-enabled, startups. You have labs, pharmacies, payers. So you have those covered entities. Those all do different things, and they all have relationships between them. And then you have business associates. You have applications that sell to providers, that sell to payers. You have health navigators and Medicare brokers. You have non-covered entities. You have patients themselves who want healthcare data. You have public health. You have clinical trials, pharmacy or pharma, life insurance, lawyers. And so 14, 15 different organizational types there. Each has different needs. Each has different workflows. And so if you just do the simple math of just assuming one unique workflow between each type, it's like 200 combinations. And some of those problems are solved and some are completely analog. And it ranges from prior authorization, clinical data exchange, record retrieval for life insurance, record retrieval for providers. And it's not just, let me toss some clinical data over the wall and that solves interoperability. It's actually like, what does each of those workflows look like in a digital era? And do we have the infrastructure there for it yet? The answer is resoundingly no on the whole, but for specific problems, it's yes.
It feels like one of those it depends answers for sure. Let's pick on the most common organization type that we probably see in health tech today, the tech enabled, you mentioned tech enabled services. They have a lot of reasons to want to tap into some of these solutions. If you were an IC PM today listening to this podcast and you've never solved an interoperability problem before, where should you go to learn how to solve for your use cases?
Well, you got to go ask Health API guy GPT, like the AI version of me, which does not exist. But I'm just kidding. I think
are you working on this?
No, everyone is, right? Like if you're not, you're behind. But no, I think health tech nerds and digital communities that popped up in like the COVID era, everyone's like, can't go outside, might as well join a Slack community. That's actually well worth the price of admission, just because any question like this, you're like, what should I use for forms? Or what should I use for this interoperability problem? Somebody's thought about it and somebody's going to answer it. And so that crowdsourcing, that's really, really powerful. There's many reasons to join health tech nerds or other similar communities, but I think that one alone is worth what it costs. I think also there's just increasingly a ton of free impartial content. So I think of the eras of content on the internet for health tech. And first it's just like, you're reading it, but it's bullshit. Sorry, earmuffs for kids. It's bullshit because they're just trying to sell you something with it as a vehicle. And then you have sort of the growth of the Substacks and things like that have slightly less bent in that way. And now you have sites like Allianz that are like, their whole business is to try and be impartial. And I think that's in my career, just watching that grow, it's become something you can actually learn from versus just trying to peek through the curtain and figure out what's bullshit and what's real, which is still the case if you go to the marketing website for many products.
In your content, you talk a little bit about the different types of solutions out there. Like for example, like a headless business or some of the Fire APIs, which are considered on-ramps, or even like Flexpa, who's an open aggregator, and then there are closed aggregators. Can you talk a little bit about each and every one of those?
Yeah, you're talking about the API Bible article I wrote. Yeah, and so if you're looking at API companies, every API company is going to go, we're Stripe for this, we're Plaid for that. And it just doesn't mean anything at that point because they're wrong. They're actually lying to you. And that was the impetus for that article. And if you're looking at them and they have an API, they're one of four things. One is they're making software, they're making SaaS, and they're just offering an API. They're saying, oh, you kind of want control via programmatic control and not just via, the interface we give you. Okay, that's great. Like a headless business, especially like headless EHR, can be very powerful if you're a builder. You're really like a tech in the spectrum of tech enabled. You're really tech enabled, but it's not really an API company in the sense of like a Stripe or a Plaid. Those are all networks, and so. If you think about networks, either you're an on-ramp, you're providing access to a pre-existing network, or you're building a network, you're an aggregator. And so companies like Flexpa, we aggregate open content, these mandated APIs, and make it available so that you don't have to go do that work yourself. There are closed aggregators that build business relationships that are unique to them, like a Redox or something, to build a network. And so those are some of the tactical ways to segregate and think about API companies. I think more better for the random IC thinking about vendors is thinking about okay, what these axes you can start to divide them on. What problem are they solving? So what data is being made available, or what workflow are they accomplishing? Is it claims data? Is it clinical data? Is it wearables? Is it provider directory data? Is it cost transparency data? Those are all different problems, different data sets that help you solve different problems. What's the method of access? Is it an HIE? Is it patient or consumer authentication? Is it a different mechanism? And then what's the modality? Is it an API? Is it a user interface? Is it a flat file? And so segmenting in that way, you can start to pick apart these vendors and say, do they have the right modality for me? Health Gorilla has a user interface. Particle only has an API. Zeus has a plugin to my EHR. So modality matters, content, so the actual data types matter, and cost matters, right? Going and getting price shopping for different companies and vendors that offer the same thing obviously important.
I really like the way that you simplify that to think about it, because I think sometimes when you aren't as familiar, it is very overwhelming to try to figure out what are the different axes in which you can evaluate these vendors. So I think you said modality, the content, and the cost would probably be the three to sort of parse out these vendors to then figure out which one is the best for your specific use case.
Totally. And like how you figure that out, well, you can ask them and be very blunt, and they should be honest. But like it's sales, you never know if you're going to get a shark or the honest Abe type of salesperson. I tend to go and look at their website and say, look at who do they serve? Specifically, who are their customers? Are those customers like me? That's one. Two is, what is their product list? That can help distill things. But like, actually more importantly, their developer documentation. You can usually, there's other tools like Built With you can use to find if it's not visible or public, but APIs are honest where marketing websites aren't. And so like going look at the API, you can say, okay, how would this work? Gets you a little closer. And then press releases, like obviously kind of BS, but they're trying to tell you something. They're trying to project something to the world. And that can be really good. So like, that's what I do anytime I'm looking at a random industry. I'm like, let me go look at ed tech APIs because it's a Saturday and I'm bored.
I think that all the time on Saturdays.
Yeah. I had a long paternity leave, so I had to do something with my daughter.
That's really smart, the way that you think about that to get to the truth versus what they're trying to project. And when you think about this area, can you describe the regulatory challenges that are common with interoperability?
Sure. Let me ask a question. Are either of you guys, either now or back in the day, a gamer?
I did dabble, if I do say so myself.
Okay. Well, imagine product management as like an RPG, like a role-playing game. And I think of product management as like different trees, skill trees you might take. And I think regulatory comprehension is a PM superpower. It's taking the subject matter expert PM skill tree all the way to level 100. Like if you're doing that, you deeply understand the space. And that's something that's when you're applying for a job or when people are looking for something special about you, very easy to point that and be like, okay, I can do this. I can go read a 200-page document. Can everyone do that? Not really. And so I think that's a superpower. It's not one that everyone has to have, but it's definitely something as a PM, if you are able to think, it's kind of interesting. Let me go see what the CMS is doing. There's a severe advantage to that. Largely speaking, you guys know this, healthcare is regulated. Every piece of it's regulated. It's bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans are going to keep throwing regulation at us. And neither is going to have a really severe deregulatory effect. And especially for interoperability, they keep pushing things forward. There's going to be new national infrastructure, new capabilities, new EHR requirements. So for digital health practices, for tech-enabled service providers, you're going to be affected by this in certain ways because it's going to go and say, hey, you actually have to go and do TEFCA or do prior authorization. And you can view that as compliance. Your EHR vendor certainly will, but you can also view it as what operational efficiencies can I gain by doing this? And so I think there's this false narrative that's really popular, especially in like Silicon Valley, like via Bill Gurley and that type of thing. That's like regulation stops innovation and, makes the incumbents, like entrenches the incumbents. Sure. Like there's a few cases that happens, but it's actually bullshit. The opposite is it's provably false where companies said, oh shit, there's this regulation coming. Let me take advantage of it and disrupted or became dominant. And so I think if you stay on top of regulation, if you're that superpower, the PM with that superpower, and you help your company stay on top of it, it's an extreme tailwind. It can, there are companies existing today that 5 years ago had $1 million in ARR and now have 100 million in ARR only because of regulation. And so it's laughable. And it's sort of saying, I have to go buck regulation and try and fight against it. Or, I'm a prior auth startup or something. Maybe you pay attention to the prior auth rule and take advantage of it. So yeah, I think that PM should sign up for the ONC's newsletter. They should get into the regulatory channel and health tech nerds. It's not just interoperability. telehealth, e-prescribing, CMS reimbursement. There's so many like sub niches that people can take advantage of and become experts in a way that's differentiating.
Sounds like somebody played Diablo 2 maybe back in the day.
That's right. You got me. Level 99 barbarian. You got me.
I love it. So you talk about, like, we just recently talked to Drew Vashista, and he talked about the native digital health tech product manager. You mentioned a lot of those. I feel like it's an addition, add to what he had said, but it definitely jives. I think it's not enough to know, just even the technology, or you got to understand the buyers. You got to understand all the nooks and crannies of healthcare, and you hit that on the nail, I think, right there. Let's talk about something a little bit recent, right? And when this podcast comes out, hopefully it's still relevant. But over the weekend, April 6th, Epic, I guess, denied or kind of closed off access to care quality for Particle Health. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of rumor right now. Like Particle's put out a press release today, but largely speaking, Particle, Epic, Health Gorilla, Zeus, all the on-ramps and all the EHRs that participate in this health information network, the trust framework that is care quality, have two rules. Rule one, you have to be providing treatment. So you have to be a provider giving some sort of treatment to the patient. And rule two is sort of a quid pro quo. You have to give back data. There has to be reciprocity. And so underpinning Epic's decision, which is to not respond to the queries of certain Particle Health customers, not all, but some, was the belief or proof that fraud or abuse has happened. And like, I don't want to cast judgment there. I think they'll figure it out. Someone else can cast judgment, but it is irrefutable that this is happening on the network today, that there are lawyers on the network, that there's pharma on the network, that there's clinical trials on the network, that there's payers on the network. And all of those parties deserve to have access in some way, right? They have some good business reason to have access, but not as treatment. And so figuring that out is the biggest problem, and that is that care quality has to figure out, that we as in the healthcare community have to figure out, because otherwise we just are saying HIPAA doesn't matter, data privacy doesn't matter, patient privacy doesn't matter. And in these particular times, with different threats to women's health, with different increasing privacy regulation at the state level, all these different reasons, we have now more of a need to care about privacy than ever, to sort of blanket say, anyone can access health data for anyone they care. It's a real slippery slope. And so, it's a good wake up call for us all to work on this, to say, give more scrutiny to something where it's been awesome, and to see Ventricle and Accolade and all these companies start to have access to prior medical records. Giving access for treatment, awesome. But as we start to expand to other use cases unintentionally, without the thought of how it should work, we're going to risk a lot of bad outcomes, period, full stop.
And with the Change Healthcare crisis, a lot of folks are moving off of Change Healthcare, right? And they're looking for expertise and help on how to do that. Do you think folks are going to be moving off of Particle? And if so, what advice do you have for them to do that in a cost-effective way, efficient way, and one for the providers that's not disruptive to care?
I think it's sort of apples and oranges in the sense that Particle's competent and Particle wants to do well by their customers. And I don't, not to say Change doesn't, but Change has not been able to deliver on that promise for 45 days, for however long it has. So switching off of Change is existential for providers, right? You need to go at a certain point and start billing those claims. I expect the Particle team and Epic team, who are both very competent and both ultimately trying to help their patients, help providers, to figure this out and for the network to be better for it. That's my guess. But I think there's going to be alternatives. Zeus, Health Gorilla, Metroport, all these groups that are on-ramps, they do exist. And if some customers feel a lack of trust as a result, we'll see some switching. I just don't expect it to be as drastic as Change, where it's just like, it's too long. It's just too long as a business to not be able to do this core function.
I think what, earlier when we were talking about what makes the interoperability of the problem so hard to solve, I think we just hit it, right? Which is people have very good reasons to be accessing this data, and we want to provide longitudinal care. At the same time, you want to make sure that this data doesn't get abused or used in a way that it's not intended for.
Yeah, 100%. And the best way to accomplish that is to not give people this right now. It's a huge arbitrage, right? Like, either I follow the rules and I have zero access to data, or I do some mental gymnastics and I break the rules and I have access to data. And to accomplish these really good business goals, oftentimes helping the patient, right? Like helping the patient get life insurance, helping the patient participate in a clinical trial. None of these are bad in a vacuum, but breaking HIPAA, utilizing a pathway that is just not allowed, isn't the right path. It's actually to build the paved paths that are necessary to support them and support them in the right way. Because what's right for a provider to access from another provider in terms of how it is the reimbursement, all the mechanisms might be different than what a payer accessing from a provider or pharma accessing from a provider. So if you have different paved paths and different infrastructure, you can actually tailor it to the use case much better.
Mm-hmm.
That's ultimately where I would like to get to, is just let's build what's right for these two partners to exchange at scale.
If you were to wave a magic wand, given all of this, and I mean, it's pretty negative experience for some folks, what would you change about, I guess, the networks, or
have a path for payers to participate. I'd have a path for patients to access their data with identity proofing, right? Because the big problem, no one says patients shouldn't be able to access their data via these networks. But if I say to you, hey, if I don't identity proof you, I can sign up as Little Wayne and pull Little Wayne's information, you're gonna be like, that's not good. And that's what D2C, direct patient access looks like without strong identity proofing. And so that needs to be deployed and put out into the wild. Use cases for pharma, for clinical trials, for public health. Public health can't really use these channels and pathways. And so, just getting that defined so that people can use it, and so that any abuse that does happen, there's no argument there, because you can say you should have gone this way on the thing that we made for you versus you had no other option. The desperation angle, I think, it makes people go, oh well, they had no other option. It's okay, that should be motivation for us to figure it out, not for us to facilitate data privacy violations. And I'm not saying Particle did that. I'm just saying, as a whole, the network incentivizes it right now.
Mm-hmm. We want to pick your brain a little bit more about electronic medical records. If your organization told you tomorrow, hey, we want you to go source an EMR, what would you tell them?
I'd say, Andrew, I'm really surprised that Flexpa is pivoting into providing care. But no, I'd say I can totally do that. I can get the job done, but I need to know a ton more for this decision, because this is a build buy, and the EHR is a build buy, and there's no one right answer for a provider organization, or even if you subset to tech-enabled care, virtual care, because within just digital health provider organizations, you have such a drastic variety. You have, what is the care delivery modality? Is it virtual? Is it hybrid? Is it in person? What's the geography? Is it one state? Is it many? What's the go-to-market motion? Is it direct to consumer? Is it in-network? Is it payer sales, employer sales? Is it value-based care contract? What's the patient population? Is it pediatric? Is it Medicare? Is it Medicaid? Specialty? And most importantly, technical talent. So tech-enabled companies, tech-enabled digital health companies are not a monolithic cohort. They are a sliding scale, because I advise some of them. And some of them are we're building everything. We might as well be Facebook. We're, full tech team, tech. And some are we got the IT guy in the back, and we just raised $50 million because our care model is really cool. It's holy shit. How is this the same cohort? It's not. And so if you think about that spectrum, it's impossible to say like, oh yeah, one EHR is the answer. It's certainly not. Some care orgs are just like notes, e-prescribing, and D2C billing. I'm not going to name names, but like, like they exist. They like that. Hims and Rome and stuff like that. Some are brick and mortar value-based care. And so there's plenty that I like, right? Like if I'm thinking, let me buy something, I want to be able to build on top of it. Healthy, Canvas, Elation, even Athena Health. Those all can be great, or they can be absolute disasters, just depending on your unique needs, like telehealth or in person. The same goes for fully headless EHRs. So you have like MedPlum. MedPlum, you're not getting a ton of UI out of the box, but you can build whatever you want better than, if you're a true builder, MedPlum's a great chassis to build on. And so if you're copy pasting your EHR decision from another care organization, you are essentially admitting that your company is copy pasted from another care organization. Do you want to admit that? I don't think you want to admit that. So that's how I think about it. So I would go back to leadership and I'd say, here's what I know about our requirements, who we are. Tell me if I'm missing something.
Wow. That's the second quote. Earlier quote, you said APIs don't lie. And I'm going to put that on my tombstone. All right, Brendan. So how do you think about systems of record versus systems of use? I hear this all the time, and I don't really know a good answer, right? Like when it comes to building on top of an API enabled EMR, like who's running the show here?
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, old school, before the growth of tech-enabled digital health providers, you just had your EHR. It was the system of record and the system of use. But the pressures of, being a tech-enabled, venture-backed company mean that you're like, that patient experience is not good enough. That provider experience is not good enough. But we still want the aspects of compliance. We want all the functionalities, and maybe we do want some of the user interfaces. So having that system of record still be that EHR, it just decoupled, right? Just having the APIs to build the really cool patient app that plugs right into it, or perhaps even your own provider screens or care management screens. You have companies like Oak Street. They still have their system of record, their core EHR, Greenway, but then they've basically rebuilt everything to be much better for their physicians and their care management team separate, just referencing it. And so, again, nothing is right. I hate to not have the silver bullet for people listening to this, but certainly identifying, I am a virtual care company or I am a tech-enabled provider company. What is my differentiator? Mm-hmm. Is it that patient app? Is it a certain improvement for the provider workflow? And then making sure you have the right level of API-enabled EHR, a decoupled EHR, or a headless EHR, a MedPlum. That comes down to just how much do you want to have the systems of use not be the defaults from some EHR and be something that you think you can do better. Some people view that as redundant, undifferentiated work. And some people say, look how shit everything is today. We can do better.
Yeah. You say that's like a non-answer, but I think it's a great answer. I think you're basically saying if it's core to your business, if it's core to your model, it makes sense to build something to be systems of use and then have the EHR being systems of record. The Canopy Greenway example, I think, is a good one. So that's a great answer. Thanks.
And we know that Flexpa uses MedPlum, that headless EHR that you were talking about. And so given that Flexpa is an open aggregator, can you explain that strategy and the decision behind that?
Yeah. I'll go on a brief interlude here because I just want to say it really loudly for everyone to hear. I love MedPlum. I love it so much. Imagine you're on that first date or you're hanging with a new friend and everything is clicking. There's that je ne sais quoi feeling. You just get along. That's Flexpa and MedPlum. They're open source. So it's if I want to go fix something, the team wants to go fix something, you just have agency. You can just go do it. They think about the same problems in the same way we do. And they have a similar tech stack. So we can go and contribute. We understand it. They ship fast. I'm we're going to go here, report this issue, and then we'll have to go fix it. And then they go and they put it out the next week. So they're awesome. And the other thing about MedPlum is that it's not just an EHR. It's under the hood is like a fire server. And so we don't use any of the EHR capabilities. We just use the fire server because it's, I think, best in class for that. And so anyway, love letter to MedPlum. I don't know if you knew you were getting that, but it's like one of those technologies that once you use certain tools, you're like, shit, I gotta go hype that. And then, yeah, they're awesome.
I love the Love Fest. I don't know that I've ever had a partnership or a vendor relationship where I can shout it from the rooftops the way that you just did that for MedPlum. So that's incredible for you too.
One day, Angela, you'll find that vendor.
I will continue to go on my blind dates.
We'll be sure to link out the MedPlum and shout them out in the comments or in the show notes. Awesome. That's incredible. Let's shift gears to your experience, because I think your work history is actually quite interesting. I don't know how intentional it was, but it seems from the outside in, it seems very intentional. And what I mean by that is when you look at the order of operation or like the job sequencing, it was Epic to Redox to Zeus Health and now Flexpa. So you've kind of gone from electronic health record to two on-ramp companies and then onto this open aggregator, but like all touching various different problems, but still very core technology stuff. I mean, Brendan, like, tell us, like, was that, you just a mastermind genius behind that? Like, how intentional was that? Was this part of your plan on becoming an authority in interoperability, and how do others follow your footsteps?
Oh yeah, I got out of college. I was like, interoperability in healthcare. Let me go find all the companies. No, it's completely unintentional, and like that's been most of my career. I was on the track to be in the Air Force. I did ROTC. Didn't work out. That's a conversation for in person, maybe some beers or something. And then I desperately needed a job. I did not want to go home to parents' basement. So I was about to go to Accenture. I don't know what Accenture Brendan would have been like. And instead, a friend was like, hey, why don't you come up to Madison and work at Epic? And so complete happenstance, transformative for my life, my career. I'm married to someone I met at Epic. Like there's all these things that you can derive from it. And similarly, coming back from Epic in the Netherlands, I moved to San Francisco. I'm like, I need to get a job. I need to get outside the Epic bubble. I want to be in person because I'm in SF. And then I had applied to all these different startups, and it was either a clinical trial startup called Go Balto, which was in person, it was in SF, or Redox, which was remote, but it was, some ex-Epic people, still healthcare. And I was kind of leaning Go Balto, and they just completely ghosted me, and I needed to respond to Redox. And so I said, let's try this remote thing, which now feels prescient, or at least feels like I was ahead of the curve. And then I'm super psyched I did. Redux was awesome. Go Balto was acquired by Oracle like a week after I started. So I would have been working at Oracle, which is not, I don't know about you guys, like not my dream job. And all this to say, like complete unintentional route. How do you become an expert in interoperability? I think was another question you asked. But I think that, like these companies I've worked with, like Epic, they get a lot of hate this week, especially, but they do put the most data onto nationwide networks. They have the most Fire APIs. They have the most inputs and outputs and interfaces of anyone. So while working there, seeing the litany of, the full spectrum of integration and interoperability sub problems in about as semi-solved form as possible gave me like a picture of what's the ceiling, what's possible today. If it's possible or semi-possible, some Epic customers probably looking at it or trying to do it. And so that was good, like broad. And then Redox, Zeus, and Flexpa were like dive into sub problems, dive into app integration at Redox. So how does an app connect to a health system? Dive into health information networks at Zeus, dive into patient authorized access for Flexpa. And so got deeper, but it's just because it's less like, I was tactically like, I need to work there. It fit the phase of life. I went to Flexpa so I could be more remote, so I could, be with my kid more and things like that. And so, I think like there's tons of other interoperability domains that I sort of like know cursorily that I just know from curiosity, right? Like de-identify data, like the Datavance and Health Verities of the world, or prior authorization. I think like the only way to find out about those things is curiosity. And curiosity is the main driver for expertise. You can lock into what company you work at or what product you build, but curiosity is something you control. And so that to me is how you build expertise in any domain, is just wanting to know, unendingly wanting to know more about it.
And I think having that growth mindset where you're open to the idea that there are a lot of things that you still need to learn.
Totally. I think being curious, being open to opportunities, defaulting to saying yes, like all these mantras, like I'm strongly for it, because you will never know everything about a subject. And so I start like conversation, I'm like, like this is what I think, how you'd solve this integration problem or interoperability problem. But I actually don't know. Maybe the price changed. Maybe there's a new capability. And so the curiosity, even for things like the back of your hand, still needs to be there. And so I think I recommend to like young PMs, to young people like who are trying to get into the thing, I'm like, just be curious and then write it down. If you write it down, it's the best way to solidify the curiosity you've had, to distill it down from like the jumble of thoughts into a reality. And I think that forcing function creates the hard learnings that stick around. I think people get scared of that. People are easily curious, but when I say do the writing piece, they're like, oh shit, like I might get judged. There's activation energy. There's perceived opportunity costs. And like, most importantly, there's failure. And like, you guys are doing a form of not writing, but like content creation that shows that you get it. Like creating, thinking about it, trying to distill it into something is a product. And I think if you're a product manager, you got to be willing to write or create, because that's how you show you can learn everything and absorb it. But if you can't communicate it back into the world, then you're not actually showing that you're an expert, or really maybe aren't an expert.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a big part of embracing that discomfort and putting yourself out there and being open to failure or being exposed to people's judgment when you are, creating content or, writing. So I think that is a big part of growth, is that where you're uncomfortable and you have to stretch yourself.
There's no failure, right? Like it's like if you just are creating something and you've done it for yourself and you've like distilled the thoughts down, you're better off, right? And so the effort of doing, I think, is in and of itself, the action alone is worth it. And you only get better by doing it. Like the first articles I ever wrote were just absolute dog shit. And like, if I go back and read them, I'm embarrassed, but that's okay. Like I got better and I developed my thoughts, my way of constructing interoperability and the segmentation of things just by trying to put it down pen to paper.
And I remember when we were talking, and we'll get into more of the health API guy here in a second, you were saying a lot of this you were doing and gathering knowledge internally. And then when you write, then you're sort of putting out into the universe externally. And I really liked how you frame that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a confidence as you like first write for yourself and write for your team. And like, you're going to have to do that to be a PM, right? Like, you're going to have to write things down. Might be in Jira, but like eventually then you're doing PRDs, but then write everything, write longer documents, write longer form, then write for the company, and then write for the world. And like, you can build up that confidence. And like, that's actually exactly how I did it. That's exactly how I was writing for Redox internally. Then I was like, oh, let me go write for the marketing website. And let me go write on this thing I own, so I can be a little more uncaged. And so like, I don't know, like get to the uncaged level of writing. And then if you're unhinged, maybe tone it down, but uncaged, that's good.
I like that distinction. That's good. We also talked about you having a contrarian view of your career path. And so can you tell us about that view?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much of a hot take it is, but I think like rigid career planning and goals can work, but it's fundamentally anti-fragile, and you actually leave a lot of meat on the bone. And so like people will be like, oh, know exactly where you're headed, what you want, like plan it out. And I think, I don't know, it just feels like if things don't go your way, you feel like a failure. If life presents something that's off that track, you'll say no. And so like I actually advocate for build awesome things, develop expertise, and surround yourself with people, both internal and external, who know you build awesome things and have that expertise. And so like if you do that, opportunities present themselves exactly when you need or hope. And you get to have this awesome career. You get to do like, like a puppy in the dog park, running around after the cool thing. And I don't know, like I think that you should know what you want, right? Like you should know, if I want something, you should be able to prioritize that, at least in the short to medium term. But the really structured, like this is where I'm going and how I get to be CTO or something, there's just an anti-fragility to it that can lead to misses.
Speaking of getting that awesome career, let's talk about like interviewing for your product job, right? Or not for your specifically, but just in general, like what tips would you have for someone who's interviewing today for product? Could you share your approach for confirming that your vision for the product management role aligns with the expectations of the hiring company?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's really important, and it's really, really hard, especially if you're junior or you're really in love with the company, is to be brutally honest with yourself and your prospective employer about the things you want. And it gets back to like just a second ago, it's like, I don't think you need the multi-stage plan over 10 years necessarily, but you definitely need to know the things that you want out of a new role. And so you should not assume that a different role will materialize, or that benefits will change, or that you'll figure out something that there doesn't seem like there's alignment on, there's lack of clarity on. That, like my experience is, it's a coin flip. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. And until you do, you're less effective, you're less happy, you can even get resentful of your job. So I think by being super crisp and saying these are things that are important to me, one, you're expressing this confidence that's really refreshing to a hiring manager. That's really refreshing to somebody when they say, oh, like I think it's really important that what's your paternity leave? And they say, okay, we don't really have good paternity leave. Well, there's not gonna be as much conflict or problems there. There's a variety of things. It's not just benefits. It could be just about the role, right? You're like, oh, I think I'll get into product management after a bit in this role. You probably want an explicit promise, or you want something to say, yeah, this is going to really happen. And so, yeah, I think when people come to me and I'm hiring and they show that confidence to say what they want and it maps to what we have or what we could offer, I'm like, okay, cool. Like that's really awesome that this person is willing to say that, rather than just make up what's going to make them happy or make up what's going to make them successful here. I can do that. I can do that for them if they come on. And so that's my main advice to people, is just think a little bit about that. Don't be afraid to say it, because it's better to say it and just not have the role that you thought was awesome because the company's awesome. If that works out, then you're unhappy. Who cares? You've deceived yourself and you've deceived the employer.
Yeah. Is there a crispy thing you've told a previous employer before taking the job?
So I was very upfront about paternity with Flexpa, and that was great. And that led to alignment and success. I was not so clear about time zones and like working across time zones and expectations there, how remote something was. I think that's something that's very fuzzy these days in terms of, is it really remote? Is everyone remote? Do they schedule meetings that are remote? Do they bias towards async? Do they communicate well async? Like that's something that now, if I ever think about roles again, or if I'm communicating Flexpa to somebody, I make sure we're aligned there, because there's remote where it's like you're in an office or 50% is in the office, and then you're the one guy on the the speakerphone, and then you can't hear anything. You're up at 6 a.m. You certainly want to assess that sort of thing out. And so, yeah, that's bitten me before, but luckily I was young and didn't have a kid.
And you sort of talk about these different product management archetypes, right? Do you have to be the politician, the sales engineer, the Jira jockey? I really liked how you talked about that. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah. So back to the RPG. Okay. So you have these different shapes.
Barb.
Yeah. You have these different PM shapes, and like, there's no one ideal PM. Instead, you have different backgrounds and skill sets. So I came from sales and customer facing roles. Cool. Like I know how to talk to customers. That's a skill tree. That's a differentiator. And you can take that for a long way. You have deep user empathy. Technical roles can understand data and product deeply. Strategic minds can, the MBAs can understand like the market conditions, the competition to make really good bets. And so I think about it as like, those are the three legs of the PM stool. And those are the skill trees, general, and there's like subsets. And if you're able to, match your skill set, those skill sets with the needs of the PM role that you're applying to or you're at, you're going to be happy. But if you're hired and you're thinking, I'm this MBA, I'm a strategic mind, and it's sort of like a Jira jockey type role, an unempowered PM who is just given something to go and, translate to the engineering team. Oh boy, like that's not going to be fun. And so a real important part of getting when hiring is understanding, what are they looking for? Is it the right fit? And so I think a good question to ask is just, who am I going to be working with most closely? Did they mention engineers? Is it other PMs? Is it customers? Is it strategy? Is it executives? And if they say, oh yes, like everyone, you work with everyone. Sure, that's true. But like push harder, because it's not satisfactory or honest. There's someone you can tease out. Do they view you as a Jira jockey? Are you going to be working exclusively with the engineers? Do they say, oh yeah, it's customers and sales? Okay, sweet. Like you're forward facing. You're getting the tighter iteration loop. And so for me personally, I don't think I would take a product job if they don't mention customer and sales interaction. I thrive on that. Like that's really important to me. It's really, really important to me that the products that I'm involved with, that I understand those needs and have customer empathy. But like many backgrounds, many skill sets, many also desires. And so there's different ways to use that question of like who you'd work with to figure out, is the role aligned? Is it the politician role? Is it it's basically a support role?
And Brendan, do you feel like you can push harder during the interview process later in your career where you really know what you want? Or do you find that anyone can do it, even someone who's more entry level or an independent contributor can do that? Or do you feel like earlier in your career you should make concessions so that you can really learn from a certain environment, such as an Epic, and understand what's good, and then move to more of an ideal type of fit?
You certainly can, right? Like if you have no idea what you want, then you can just go for it. Like the only thing you want is a role. Great. But there's a lot of people that if you tease it apart, they actually do have things they want out of the product role. They have things they want out of this junior role. And so that's why it has to be looking hard at thyself and coming to grips with this, because it's not, even if you're junior, you probably want something, and maybe it is just a role. But actually, like I mentioned in the last question, if someone just wants a role, okay, well, do they really want Flexpa? Do they really want the role we have? Or are we just a job? So it's actually, the more opinionated you are, the more it's like, okay, you actually match what we found really good match. And it's like hiring's like dating, right? Like you're in it, you're putting a ring on, you're getting married as soon as you get that contract. And so, not that there's a contract when you're married, that's weird, but you know what I mean? Like there's a semi-permanence to it. It's really, you're spending a lot of time onboarding to let someone go is really hard. So finding right fit, finding alignment by not just matching on, oh yeah, like I need a position, but being like, oh yeah, this company is exactly what I want. This role is exactly like what I want, is differentiating. And so at Flexpa, when we've hired, it's been people who really, really want to work at Flexpa and really, really want to work at a role, as most recently we hired for an engineer. Well, that engineer is customer facing. That engineer is on sales calls. That engineer understands HubSpot. And okay, that the person we hired, Kyle, highly aligned with that, wants that, has sought that out before. Sweet. Like that, I feel strong confidence in that hire in a way that I wouldn't if just someone wanted a role.
Mm-hmm.
You incorporate a ton of fun I'd say, into, or a sense of humor into the seemingly dry topic at times, right? Like interoperability, or like I think I've seen more than one Game of Thrones meme or reference in your content. And it also seems like Flexpa is very supportive of your writing endeavors. And I'm wondering like how you've brought that kind of sense of humor, or that, I don't know what to call it, I guess that passion for cultivating fun into, or a positive work culture into your organization. How has that worked for the product organization, or even the tech organization?
Yeah, I mean, communication is hard. People do not listen. People do not read. I'll say this again for people that weren't listening or reading to this, but like people don't listen. Communication is hard. And so humor is a hook. Humor is a hook to have people stay engaged. Humor is a hook for people to read through the whole article. Humor is just something to bind people to whatever you're trying to convey. And it's hard because you want to be, when you're doing something that's educational, when you're doing something that's technical, humor can be distracting. And so like there's that balance, but ultimately the trade-offs are worth it, because adding humor, adding clear language makes you simplify, makes you try and make it a little less dense. And so my experience has been articles that are funny, people listen to, or at least pretend to. And articles that are not, people don't read. And at least the numbers on like Substack show that. And so humor also is something that ChatGPT and Claude, I don't know, they don't do well yet. So it's like a good moat against our AI or overlords. So if you're like, okay, I don't want my job to be taken, well, humor.
So go get a degree in comedy and then come to healthcare.
Yeah, right. I'm actually not that funny. Memes are pretty easy. You just gotta keep working on them.
Omar, you and I are gonna do improv next.
I don't know, maybe.
I will be embarrassed to admit this, but I have Googled many, many times how to be funny. So I'm just gonna admit that.
Are you an AI? Omar, are we sure that Angela isn't an AI?
I've seen her in person, but sometimes I'm always questioning.
It's hyper realistic. All right, we've talked a lot about writing, and so you are the health API guy. It's incredible. Can you tell us about why you started that, how you started that, and that journey?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the journey I sort of like briefly went through earlier. Like I know some things. I worked at Epic, so I knew a lot. And I went to Redox, and I said, shit, I want Redox to know these things. So I started to write things on the internal blog, and the marketing team came to me and said, hey, this one was really good. Can we reformat it and send it externally? They're like, it could be a good content piece. I'm like, sure, I've never done that before, but let's do it. And so we did that. It got some nice views. I got some nice feedback from people in the HL7 community and customers. I was like, that's cool. Like, let me do more of it. And so I started to do that a little bit faster. And the internal review process, marketing has a lot of things they needed to do. And so it was backed up, and I went to the CEO and I said, hey, can I go write this on this new thing, Substack? And I'll just point to Redox, because it's kind of nice and impartial. It's like, oh, here's somebody writing about it. And like, when rather than be like hype my company, it's point to it when it makes sense. So yeah, that's like, that led to it, and then continued to do it, continued to write things that I was saying repeatedly. Like, ultimately, I don't write all that often. I'm not committed to a particular cadence. I'm not like doing a weekly newsletter or bi-weekly. I write the things that people ask me about a lot. And so I have notes about them. I have tweets about them, a lot of content I built elsewhere. I sort of package it up and I put it up as an article, add some funny memes, or at least memes that attempt to be funny, and I ship it. You know, like a PM ships based on customer demand. I'm shipping based on what people are asking about. And so I find that it unlocks better conversations. If I can say, hey, like in advance of this, go read about integration or go read about, interoperability, suddenly we can just go directly into like, okay, you're a DME orders startup, medical device startup, sorry, acronym. And like, we can just talk about like solving for that versus how does integration work, or what are the technologies, or whatever. And so laziness is a key thing to think about when you're writing.
What you mentioned, you write about the things that people tend to ask you a lot. What are the top 3 things that people ask you?
The HR selection. So like where Health API guy went from like a few people reading it to like 15,000 people read it overnight or whatever, is to be HR or not to be HR. So like Shakespearean EHR selection. It's older, but it still has the most views by a long shot. It's still, we talked about it earlier, it's still relevant. There's been other good resources like Elion that have added on to it. Canvas has a good post about it. And it's sort of like put the headless EHR concept. That probably someone else had said something like that before, but I get a lot of references as like having come up with that. How to win friends and integrate systems, because it's like the core thing of like, I need to integrate to an EHR. How do I think about that? Super common problem. So that is, people reference that, or I send it to people in advance of a conversation quite a bit. And then API Bible. So frustration with Stripe for X, Plaid for Y, hated the metaphor, want to prove them wrong. But actually, like, I think it's the one I'm most proud of. I got to look at all these parallel industries, like what's going on in fintech, what's going on in marketing tech, what's going on in ed tech. And that, like that side quest or whatever, you open up a lot of like what could be done in healthcare when you do that sort of thing.
I think it's also when you read the API Bible, and I hear that expression a lot, right? The Plaid of X or the Stripe of Y. Those are 2 very impressive companies, and you make those comparisons, and you even put Flexpa and show that Flexpa is doing similar things there, and I think it's a very good plug for Flexpa, and also just indicative of how great Flexpa is.
Well, I mean, like there's like how the API functions is distinct from like quality of company. Flexpa is great. Are we Stripe level yet? I don't know about that, but like I think from an execution standpoint, we're really slim, and we put out a lot of product. And I think that's really cool. But that's distinct from just like if somebody says like I'm Stripe for X and they're not really an API or whatever, it's just hype to get VCs interested. And like, I just hate that. I don't know. Everyone should hate like fake hype based on just like cargo culting off of another company.
Like a vertical platform with an API, basically.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get you.
You are this prominent writer. You have a lot of people that read your writing, and you are an advisor to a lot of companies, including startups. Do you think that those 2 things are related? And, what advice would you give to product folks who are looking to be advisors for startups? Yeah,
I think the challenge here is that like advising mostly comes by virtue of not thinking about it or pursuing it too much. Like you're like not thinking about it, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, someone's like, hey, what if do you like advising? I'm like, is that consulting? What is it? What is advising? And so, yeah, it came from writing. Somebody was like, I like what you wrote. Do you want to be an advisor? Here's some equity. Can we meet every so often? And then since then, I took on a lot earlier in my career because I, again, had no child. I now have a 1-year-old, which is its own sort of advising time sink, but constant advice. She doesn't listen. I don't get it. But, and I just found that there's actually a wide spectrum of advising. And some are like every so often they ask a question or an intro. Some you're like pounding the pavement, helping them fundraise. Some you're doing their product management until they can hire a PM. And so it's not really all that fun all the time. It's not all that glorious all the time. It's not certainly like not a money-making endeavor, except unless equity pays out or you somehow get a good compensation structure. But if you're interested in it, I think it's a great mechanism to have that curiosity, have that learning, and sate it. You get to see different organizational structures. You get to see different team compositions, different tools, and like certainly different problems. And so I've never worked at a virtual care company, but I advise one, Rivero, and I get to see the full, like how the bread is baked. That's really cool. And so I think that's the biggest like reason to go after and do advising. And I think the way that you tracked it, you can be really targeted. You can go and say like, hey, I'm an expert in this. Do you need an advisor? You're gonna have a lot of misses before you get a hit, but I have friends who have done that path. I think more it's just like what we talked about earlier. It's like project out into the world through writing, through content, through the things you've done, your expertise. And startups or other companies are going to identify and say, oh shit, that person has something to help me solve problems that I couldn't otherwise. And if you have specialized experience, it certainly helps, right? Like if you're just a product manager, there's a lot of product managers out there. But if you're interoperability or EHR selection or digital health market, or have grown a team to be a huge team, like there's tons of ways to specialize, and then to say to the world, like, here's an article on growing a huge product team and managing a huge product team, or whatever problems these companies are trying to solve. And once they find them, they'll come to you and say, you're an expert in this. Help us be successful. And so, yeah, for me, that's interoperability. That's EHR selection. Product management, more generally, is something I've definitely helped with. And just like digital health marketplace awareness. But the specialty can be anything. It's just making sure people know that you actually know that. Because if you've always focused internally, and then no one will know except for your colleagues.
Brendan, you've done so much already, but what's next for the healthcare API guy?
I got to get some of the work in progress like out the door. I have like so many articles. I have an article on Change. I have an article on like what it really is a certified EHR, on HIEs, on Epic, and some other ones that are like more nascent. And so I need to focus in and get them out. I think it's tough because one, I write really long articles. My editors keep saying like 10,000, no one reads all that. Just chop it in half. And I refuse to do it. I like the whole piece, right? Like that's my monument. And I might be wrong, but it's just my hill to die on. And also just like insights and inspiration. You can manufacture them, but they're better if they are built when they come to you. And so, yeah, I like to put the articles out when they're ready. But that's what's next, is just to keep putting out the things that people are interested in and I know about.
All right. We have arrived at our very exciting concept closing call. And so, Brendan, would love to ask you, are there any frameworks or methods or processes that you've found to be especially helpful that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally a less is more for frameworks and methods. I use getting things done for like my own tactical organization. Like that's a ubiquitous book at this point. I just modified it for myself. Kano model and like for product prioritization. I'm sort of a basic bitch when it comes to product like methodologies and things like that. You guys have actually recommended things that I'm like, oh yeah, I need to maybe do a little bit more listening to the Lennies of the world and things like that.
What is a tool that is highly valuable to you that you think others may not be using?
Well, I already did my love letter to MedPlum, so I'm going to give some other tools. Let me just call them out. I'm calling out strongly. I think Datadog is awesome for observability. I think people don't realize it replaces like Mixpanel, Amplitude, all these other things. And yeah, it's expensive, but like it's because it's awesome, and they continually make it more awesome. I think WorkOS is also awesome. It's a replacement for Auth0 and Okta. I don't think you should use Okta or Auth0 for logins anymore. WorkOS is fractionally cheaper and way easier. So like, I'm sorry, Okta, if you ever listen to this, but like WorkOS is distinctly better. Yeah, those are two like hype tools like that you should consider. Save yourself some money and some headaches.
What are some concepts in healthcare that excite you at the moment?
I think we talked about it, infrastructure, networks, just like all those nascent and analog networks that people are building into digital things. I think network effects is the only real moat in technology. Everything else is fleeting, is temporary. Like all the strategy minds are like, oh, we're building a moat. It's like, if it's not network effects, it's not permanent. And even network effects can go away as people flee a platform. But it's one that you like look at Twitter. Like Twitter has done everything to kill themselves, and network effects have kept it alive. And so I'm obsessed with networks and network products. And I think referrals, image exchange, study subject identification, open scheduling, prescription transfer, like there's so many networks to be built in healthcare that are really freaking hard to build. But do you want a non-disruptible permanent legacy? Build a network product.
Do you think product management is science or an art?
Art. It's definitely art. Each company is like a different canvas, right? Like there's different, some are going to be sculpting, some are going to be graffiti, some are NFT pixel art or something. And like each product role, like we talked about, has totally different demands of the PM. So it could be that GR jockey, it could be the master politician, it could be the voice of the customer, it could be a pseudo account executive, an implementer, subject matter expert, developer even. And so are you going to be Picasso and like just do the one art form? You're probably staying at one company and really developing that skill set, or you're building the ability to do a bunch of different tools, you're changing your chisel out for a mallet or a paintbrush. And so I think PMs as an artist have to be willing to, there's no science to it. It's not this methodical, here's the equation. It's building competency with the right tools to build something beautiful.
And lastly, where can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out? And do you have any other shameless plugs?
Done some pretty shameless plugs and and love letters, but flexpa.com, flexpa.substack.com. Please sign up there because I sometimes publish over there. My colleagues publish over there. It's also good content. Health API guy, substack.com for aforementioned content. You can come to Twitter for like unrepentant, slightly more unhinged, maybe not uncaged. And you can go to LinkedIn for more like uncaged content. And so you call me, beat me if you want to reach me.
Kim Possible.
That's right.
I've been loving these references. Brendan, that wraps up basically all that we've wanted to chat. This has been a blast of a conversation. Angela and I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you for coming onto the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thanks, Brendan.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you liked this episode, don't forget to leave us a rating and a review on your podcast app of choice. And make sure to click the follow button so you never miss a new episode. This episode was produced and edited by Marvin Yue with research help from Aditi Treya. We're Angela and Omar, and you've been listening to Concept to Care.